In 1989, a fire tore through an old Amish meeting house in rural Pennsylvania. What firefighters found beneath the pulpit would unravel a secret buried for generations. 6 engraved stones, a sealed vault, and the skeletal remains of a young woman holding a newborn child. But that was only the beginning. Because once investigators opened the floor, they uncovered something the community had spent decades trying to forget. Before we uncover the full truth, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is a story that was never meant to be told. The fire wasn't supposed to reveal anything. It had started in the wiring above the pulpit. Faulty, old, dry. The wooden beams caught fast, feeding on decades of varnish and scripture and silence. By the time the smoke rose over East Bridge, the meeting house was already half gone. Neighbors formed a bucket line. The men prayed as they worked. The women stood with folded arms, lips tight, eyes down. The flames burned through pews, hymnals, and the wall behind the altar. And then the floor gave way. That was when they saw it. Beneath the pulpit, beneath the planks, beneath the church that had stood for more than a century. There was a room. The firefighters called it a cellar, a chamber, a crawl space. But it wasn't any of those. It was a vault, sealed tight, walls reinforced, air thick with decay. The first to go down was Captain Wilkes. He radioed up, voice tight. "You're gonna want the sheriff out here. We've got something. Jesus, I think these are bones." 6 of them, in all, each buried in its own corner, each marked with a flat stone etched with initials, some male, most female. One stone was smaller, curved like a cradle. The sheriff's team arrived by dawn. So did the press, the coroner, the state investigators, but no one from the community came forward to explain. They called it an old storage space, said the names meant nothing, that the vault had been sealed since before most were born. But then someone found the journal, tucked in the walls, pages stained with time and something darker. It was written in careful script, unsteady in places. The first entry was dated March 3, 1989. The name inside, Esther Marie Esch. Age, 19. Missing since 1989. Never reported. Her final words filled the last page, written days before the vault became her tomb. They said my voice was a temptation. They said the child would bring ruin. They said silence was the only way to save the community. The vault was never supposed to be found, but now it was open. And the truth had started to rise with the smoke. The storm came without warning. No buildup, no slow approach from the horizon, just a sudden violence that split the sky open over Lancaster County. Thunder shook the low hills, rolling across the fields like distant cannon fire. At 3:12 a.m., lightning struck the roof of the East Bridge meeting house. Dry cedar shingles caught flame before the rain could catch up. By the time anyone arrived, the fire had already carved through the upper rafters. The flames spared the sanctuary itself. No pews were lost, no Bibles charred, but the ceiling collapsed inward, blackening the beams and coating the pulpit in soot. When the smoke cleared, the bishop declared it an act of God. "A reminder," he said during Sunday service, standing beneath the skeleton of a roof, "that even his house must be humbled." Jacob Lance didn't speak during that sermon. He watched from the back, hat in hand, shirt still smelling faintly of ash from the night before. At 23, he was the youngest carpenter trusted with restoration. His father, Abraham Lance, had rebuilt barns all over the county. Jacob was following in his steps, but quieter, more curious, always asking questions the others avoided. They began work the next day. The meeting house had been built in 1847, and no one had touched the foundation since. The smoke-blackened walls had to be scrubbed, the beams replaced, the roof reconstructed. But it was what lay under the pulpit that no one expected. On the 3rd day, they began lifting the stone platform where the preachers sat. The stone was heavier than it looked. 6 of them wrestled it free, revealing what should have been packed earth or solid ground beneath. Instead, there was a gap, an uneven hollow, barely more than a foot wide. Cold air breathed up from the crack like a sigh. Jacob reached for a flashlight. He aimed the beam downward and saw stairs. Stone, old, covered in webs and dust. A vault. The other men backed away, murmuring. "I never knew this was here," murmured Eli Stoltzfus, the oldest among them. "I helped rebuild this floor in '74, said Moses Troyer. "There was no mention of stairs then." The bishop was called. He arrived within the hour, stepping down from his buggy with his gray beard swaying and his expression unreadable. He studied the opening in silence. "Seal it," he said after a long pause. "We have no need of old rooms and older ghosts." But Jacob hesitated. What if it's not just a root cellar? What if it's something important? "It is not ours to disturb," the bishop replied. "This house is for the living, not the buried." That should have been the end of it. But that night, Jacob returned alone. He brought a lantern and gloves, and left his horse tethered far enough down the road that no one would hear it. The stairs were rough and slick with age, carved directly into the foundation stone. The air smelled of wet stone and rot. He counted 23 steps before reaching the bottom. The vault was narrow, maybe 15 feet by 20. Dirt walls, no windows. The ceiling was low, forcing him to hunch. His lantern cast long, swinging shadows as he walked. Against the far wall stood something he hadn't expected. A line of standing stones, 6 in total, each one carved and fitted into the earth like miniature headstones. No names, no dates, only initials, simple, spare, anonymous, AKBRCSDHMYEE, 6 stones. No record of a cemetery ever being under the meeting house. Jacob crouched near the last one. E. The stone was chipped near the base. He brushed at it with gloved hands and uncovered a sliver of cloth, white, stained, brittle as dried leaves. Burial linen? He stepped back, breath catching. The floor around the stones wasn't packed like the rest of the vault. He could see where the dirt had once been dug, disturbed, then filled in again, like shallow graves. Jacob lifted the lantern higher and turned slowly. On a small shelf cut into the wall sat a leather-bound book. Mold clung to its spine, and the pages crackled when he touched them. The handwriting was delicate. Female. Dated 1989. Journal of M.Y. April 17th, 1989. I heard her crying again beneath the floorboards. They told me to ignore it. That confession cleanses, but punishment is silent. I do not think she came here by choice. Jacob shut the book. A drop of sweat rolled down his neck despite the chill. Someone had hidden this. The stones, the journal, the implication. This wasn't a root cellar or storage room. This was something else. A secret kept quiet for decades. He climbed the stairs and didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had cleaned the journal's cover with oil and wrapped it in cloth. He kept it hidden under his mattress. The restoration continued, but Jacob wasn't focused anymore. Every word from the bishop now seemed doubled, one for the ears of the community, another hidden beneath. During lunch, he asked casually, "Was this place ever rebuilt before?" Moses Troyer shook his head. "Not since 1947, far as I know. Just the roof repairs in the 70s. What about the stones we found? No burial record?" The old man frowned. "This land was meeting land, always has been. Never for the dead." Jacob said nothing. The next evening, he paid a visit to someone he hadn't seen in years, Widow Brenneman, who lived alone near the meeting house. She was once the midwife for the district, and though her eyesight had dimmed, her memory remained sharp. She met him at the porch with a lantern and a deep stare. "You look like your father," she said, "but he knew when to leave things alone." "I found something beneath the meeting house," Jacob said gently. "Burial stones, a journal. Initials." She didn't blink. "Then you found what the rest of us were told to forget." You knew? I suspected. They said a girl had gone away, but I heard her scream. One night only, then never again. Jacob swallowed hard. Why didn't anyone speak? They did, child, but only once. The bishop said she'd gone north to Indiana, that she was carrying shame in her womb, that we should pray for her soul and turn our eyes from sin. And the others? Jacob asked. There were 6 stones. Widow Brenneman looked away. I can't answer what I don't know. I know only that one girl went in, and none ever came out. That night, Jacob returned to the journal. May 2nd, 1989. They held her down during the ritual. I watched from the slats above. She was gagged, not allowed to scream. They say it was meant to cleanse her of temptation. I think it broke her instead. June 10th, 1989. The bishop says God calls the unclean home, that her soul is in better hands now, but her body is still here. I know it is. I can feel her beneath my feet when I pray. He read until dawn. A week passed before he dared return to the vault. This time, he brought tools. Using a trowel and a small light, he began digging near the 6th stone, E. He worked slowly, quietly, taking only what he could replace without detection. 6 inches down, his blade struck something hard. He brushed back the soil. A bone, small, fragile, curved like a rib. He kept going. 10 inches deeper, he found the corner of a wooden box, rotten but still shaped. He widened the hole, careful not to splinter the edges. Inside were remnants of cloth, a small silver cross on a necklace, and the fragile curve of a jawbone, its teeth still intact. He stopped breathing. There was no more doubt. Someone had been buried here. Someone had been hidden. Not just forgotten, erased. The next morning, Jacob did the one thing the bishop had told him never to do. He contacted someone outside. By the time word of the discovery reached the county coroner, it was already too late to contain it. A worker had overheard Jacob Lance on the phone. The man hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but he'd caught enough. A jawbone. Beneath the pulpit, 6 stones. Within 24 hours, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office had dispatched a quiet team to the meeting house under the guise of building safety inspection. Sheriff Dolores Rankin arrived first, gray-suited, unsmiling, and well aware of the Amish preference to handle things within their own Ordnung. But this was different. It wasn't just a body. It was a sealed underground room. It was bones in a box. It was a crime scene. Jacob stood near the pulpit as the English officers moved around him, their radios squawking low, their boots tracking dirt across wooden floorboards no rubber sole had touched in decades. He hated the sound of it all. The snapping of latex gloves, the clicking of cameras, the scraping of tools on stone. Sheriff Rankin approached him last, notebook in hand. She was patient, but firm, the way someone had to be when dealing with witnesses who rarely used telephones and never gave statements. You found the vault during roof repairs, correct? Yes, Jacob said. After the fire, it was sealed under the pulpit. You opened it yourself? He hesitated. Yes, ma'am, alone. I went down at night. Why alone? Jacob shifted, uneasy. Because the bishop told us to seal it. Said it wasn't our concern. She paused, noting that. And when you opened it, you found what exactly? 6 headstones. Just initials. No dates, no markings. Then the journal, then the box. You dug up the remains. I didn't dig them up, he said. I found the edge of a coffin. It was broken already. I only brushed back the soil. She studied his face. You know that disturbing human remains is a felony? He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, I do now. By noon, forensics had cataloged the entire vault. They erected temporary lighting and photographed each corner, each wall, each stone. The initials were transcribed and measured. Dirt samples were bagged. The cloth Jacob had found, the burial linen, was collected, though it crumbled at the slightest touch. They found 5 shallow depressions in the vault floor, in front of the 5 headstones aligned on the left. All 5 were confirmed as previously disturbed soil. Each had signs of human decomposition beneath the surface. They also confirmed that the 6th, the grave marked EE, was different. It wasn't just disturbed, it was preserved. The skeletal remains inside, while incomplete, were unmistakably human and recent enough to show signs of trauma. The left tibia was fractured, jagged, and uneven. The ribs were narrow and malformed, indicative of a young adult female. The jaw had 3 intact teeth, one with a hairline crack, likely from blunt force injury. The silver cross necklace was bagged and logged. Meanwhile, back at the bishop's house, an emergency meeting was being held. The room smelled of beeswax and pinewood polish. The windows were cracked open to let in the warm October air, but the tension inside hung thick. Bishop Menno Glick sat at the head of the table. To his left, Elder Stoltzfus and Elder King. Across from them, Deacon Troyer. Jacob was not invited, but his father was. Abraham Lance sat silent at the edge, eyes fixed on his hands. "They've brought police into the house of God," Glick said bitterly. "And now the English media will follow. Cameras, reporters. They will twist our ways into spectacle." "We can't stop them," Stoltzfus said. "There are bones under the floor. They have every right." "They are ours," Glick snapped. "Our dead. Our mistakes to answer for. Not theirs." Abraham Lance finally spoke. "Then we should explain the stones, who they are, what happened." Glick turned to him slowly. "And what do you believe happened, Brother Lance?" Abraham didn't answer, because the truth was he didn't know. No one had told him. Not in 1989. Not in the years since. All he knew was that the 6th name, E.E., didn't match any family still living in the district, but Jacob knew where to look. That evening, he climbed to the attic of his parents' barn, where his father had kept the old district logs, handwritten ledgers that recorded births, deaths, excommunications, marriages, and migrations. He sat with a kerosene lamp on the floor and flipped through decades of careful penmanship. E.E. He scanned every year from 1970 to 1990. Nothing. No E.E. born, no E.E. wed, no E.E. buried. But then he flipped to the back of the book. A section marked in red ink, Schism Records. In June 1989, there was a brief entry. Esther Esch, age 19, unwed, expelled for fornication and refusal to repent. No further records. Jacob's breath caught. She was real. She had a name, and no one had ever said it aloud. At the county office the next day, Jacob used the public records desk to dig further. The English clerk raised an eyebrow at his plain clothes and nervous demeanor, but she was polite. "I'm looking for any record of an Esther Esch, born around 1970, lived in Bird in Hand or nearby, maybe a birth certificate or death notice." She tapped at her keyboard, scanning databases. "There's a birth record. Esther Marie Esch, born April 11th, 1970. Parents are Abraham and Lila Esch, lived on Fairview Road." "Any death record?" She clicked again. "Nope, nothing. No marriage license either. No driver's license, no hospital records. After 1989, she disappears." "Is the family still in the area?" She checked. Looks like the father passed away in 1992. The mother moved to a care facility in 2001. The family farm was sold in 1995 to a dairy operation. Jacob thanked her and walked out with a copy of the birth certificate folded in his coat pocket. Esther Marie Esch. E.E. She hadn't disappeared. She had been buried beneath the floor of the church that condemned her. That evening, Sheriff Rankin called him. "We ran DNA from the remains," she said. "Partial match with a cousin who submitted a genealogy sample years ago. It's consistent with the Esch family line." "So it's her?" "Almost certainly, but that's not the only thing." She paused. "We examined the journal you found. It mentions a cleansing ritual. Can you tell me more about what that means?" Jacob's voice dropped. "They called it that when someone broke the Ordnung in a way that shamed the whole district, especially girls, if they were caught being with outsiders or carrying before marriage." "You mean pregnant?" He nodded, though she couldn't see it. If the girl refused to repent, she could be put before the bishop's circle. Sometimes they were isolated, publicly shunned, removed. Removed how? No one ever said. They'd just be gone. Sheriff Rankin's voice was tight. "We believe Esther Esch died from blunt force trauma to the head and pelvis, likely from a struggle. It wasn't an accident." Jacob closed his eyes. "I think they tried to force repentance, and when she wouldn't, she became an inconvenience." "Yes," he said quietly. "And then they buried her." At the next Sunday service, Jacob stood outside the meeting house and watched families file in with bowed heads and dark clothes. No one spoke about the vault. No one mentioned the bones. The pulpit had been replaced. The new roof was nearly finished. The paint had been scrubbed clean, but beneath it all, 6 stones still rested in the earth. 5 nameless graves, and one with a name that finally had a voice. Esther Marie Esch. That afternoon, Jacob returned to the vault with a camera. He took photos of every stone, the soil, the shelves, the journal. He would not let them seal it again. Not this time. Jacob Lance never used to read much. Not fiction, not newspapers, not the Bible beyond what was assigned during service. But now, night after night, he read until the lantern burned low. The journal of Esther Marie Esch had become his only compass. Her words, faint and delicate, written in longhand script on yellowed paper, were all he had left of her voice. It was a voice the community had erased, but she had written everything down. Journal of Esther M. Esch, March 3rd, 1989. "They watch me closely now. Not just Mother, but the elders too. Ever since I fell ill and missed the harvest prayers. The bishop came to our home last Sunday, asked to speak with me alone. He said nothing harsh, but his eyes were heavy. I felt like a child who had dirtied the floor." March 17th, 1989. "They've begun visiting more often. Not just the bishop now, but the old men, Stoltzfus, King, Deacon Troyer. They sit with my parents and speak in hushed tones. They think I cannot hear, but I hear everything. They speak of shame, of order, of obedience. They ask if I've written letters to anyone outside. I haven't, I swear it, but I cannot hide my shape anymore." Jacob paused. He reread that line twice. "I cannot hide my shape anymore." Esther had been pregnant. The next entries grew darker. She'd written about the silence from her family, how even her own mother stopped speaking to her in full sentences. Meals were left outside her bedroom. Her youngest brother was no longer permitted to enter her room. And then came the rituals. April 1st, 1989. "They made me kneel." Elder King recited from Deuteronomy. "My sin was named aloud before the women, but they did not say the father's name. They acted as if he did not exist, as if I had conjured the baby from dust and rebellion. They say the child is the result of pride. That pride must be broken." April 14th, 1989. A girl from the next district came to see me. Her name is Miriam Yoder. She's only 15. She said she once saw the room below the meeting house, the old vault where the elders sometimes pray in silence. She told me to be careful, that some girls never come back once they go down there. Jacob looked up from the page, throat dry. Miriam Yoder, MY1 of the 5 unknown stones in the vault. He flipped forward. April 30th, 1989. I bled yesterday. Not from the child, but from the punishment. They made me scrub the altar steps for hours while reciting Psalm 51. When I slowed, Elder King struck the back of my legs with a wooden rod. I don't think my father stopped him. I don't think he blinked. They will take me to the vault soon. I know it. The entry stopped after May 5th. Jacob closed the book gently, hands shaking. He couldn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the barn loft watching the wind move through the wheat field. His father's lantern flickered below as Abraham Lance worked the lathe, unaware that his son now carried the weight of something sacred and profane, truth. By sunrise, Jacob had made his decision. He returned to the vault with fresh gloves and a measuring tape. He examined each grave, starting at the far left. 5 initials, 5 secrets, AKBR CSDHMY. He had 2 names now, Esteresh and Miriam Yoder. But the others? He needed records. But Amish records were always handwritten and held by the bishop. And Bishop Glick was the gatekeeper of the past. 2 days later, Jacob attended a quilting gathering at the bishop's home, a common event, one that offered the chance to be inside without raising suspicion. He volunteered to bring firewood inside from the shed, knowing full well where the bishop kept his old church logs. Inside the house, he moved quietly down the hallway and into the study. The bishop's desk was locked, but the filing cabinet wasn't. There, tucked behind a sheaf of baptism rosters, was a thin leather ledger labeled in faded ink, 1988 to 1990, disciplinary actions. Jacob flipped it open, careful not to crease the spine. His heart nearly stopped. March 1989, AK, expelled for violation of courting boundaries, no return. March 1989, BR, excommunicated, pregnant, refused to name father. April 1989, CS, shunning recommended. Removed to caretaker family in Indiana, never confirmed. May 1989, DH, repeated infractions. Last seen May 4th, no transfer requested. May 5th, 1989, EE, confirmed deceased. Note, internal cause, entry closed. No mention of burials, no police reports, no coroner, just phrases like no return and removed. Jacob took photos of every page with his cell phone and replaced the ledger. He barely made it out of the house before his knees gave way on the porch. The next day, he met with Sheriff Rankin at the county office. She examined the photographs. Internal cause, she read aloud. That's how they recorded a death? No autopsy, no investigation. Jacob nodded. We don't involve outside law. We don't challenge the bishop. You realize what this is? She asked. 5 people, all young, all disappeared. One we know was buried in your vault. And now we have church records that show they were disciplined at the same time, in the same place. They were buried, Jacob said flatly. All of them. The vault was used to hide them. Sheriff Rankin leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. The journal, the bones, these records. It's enough to open a criminal investigation, possibly a homicide inquiry on multiple victims. Are you willing to testify to where you found this? Jacob nodded once. I don't want silence, he said. Not anymore. Meanwhile, back in the community, rumors stirred. Families whispered about the vault. Young women began asking questions. And Bishop Glick made an announcement. On Sunday, after service, he declared that the vault would be sealed permanently, filled with concrete and left unnamed. It was never meant to be opened, he said. It was a chamber for prayer in times of trouble. Its use has been misinterpreted. We must move forward. But the vault could no longer be buried, because someone had already spoken. That night, someone slipped a letter under Jacob's door. No name, just a note on folded paper. You've stirred something dangerous. We tried to stop it once before, but the vault was always deeper than they said. There's another room, beneath the stones. Jacob stood in the vault, with the letter still in his pocket, the words heavy against his chest. There's another room, beneath the stones. The idea had haunted him all night. He had returned before dawn, slipping into the meeting house through the rear doors before the sun crested the ridge. His lantern burned low as he stared at the stone markers again. 6 headstones, initials only, pressed into the dirt like teeth clenched in silence. He knelt beside the grave marked M.Y. Miriam Yoder. If the journal had been truthful, and Jacob believed with his whole being that it was, then Miriam had seen something before she vanished. Maybe she had tried to help. Maybe she had known the truth about Esther's death and had been punished for it. But what did the letter mean? Another room. He swept the floor with gloved hands, running his fingers along the seams between stones. Most of the ground was solid, tamped earth, compact and undisturbed for years. But near the rear wall, past the 6th headstone, he noticed a difference. A slight dip in the ground. A faint outline of square stone that didn't match the rest of the floor. He tapped it with the handle of his trowel. Hollow. His stomach turned. He marked the edges with chalk, then returned with tools, a pry bar, a flashlight, and a small wooden wedge to lift from beneath. It took nearly an hour, but when he finally got the edge of the stone loose, it gave way with a groan of earth and iron. Beneath it was a shaft, narrow, just wide enough to lower a person through. A ladder descended into the dark. Jacob didn't go down. Not yet. He sealed the opening again, brushed the dust back into place, and left the meeting house with his mind racing. If what he found was what he feared, this went deeper than a single death, deeper than even the bishop's silence. He needed answers from someone who lived long enough to remember what the elders refused to tell. So he returned to the quietest house on Greiter's Hill. Widow Lydia Zook had not left her farm in 5 years. She lived alone, surrounded by knitting baskets and oil lamps, her voice barely above a whisper. Her daughter had died in childbirth. Her husband had fallen from a scaffold during a barn raising. Time had whittled her life down to silence and tea. But when Jacob knocked, she answered without surprise. "I knew you'd come," she said. "How?" "The wind's been unsettled since the fire." She ushered him inside and poured a cup of weak dandelion tea. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as he sat at the kitchen table, hat in his lap. "I need to ask about 1989, Jacob said softly. Widow Zook didn't look at him. She stirred her tea and stared into it like a pond. "Everyone who was young then is silent now," she said. "Except me. I was old even then." She looked up. "What did you find?" Jacob told her everything, about the vault, the stones, the journal, the bones. She didn't flinch. "I remember her," she said after a long pause. "Esther Esch. She had a laugh like Summer Creek water. I used to hear it from my window when she passed. Then one day it stopped." "Did anyone tell you what happened?" "They said she'd been sent away. For her shame." "But you didn't believe it." She shook her head. "Number. Because the night before she vanished, I heard something from the meeting house." She paused, her knuckles tightening around the spoon. It was the sound of dragging. Jacob's breath caught. Dragging. Like something heavy. Pulled across wood. Then nothing. No carriage. No horses. Just nothing. She set the spoon down and looked him in the eye. "You think the vault was the end of it. It was only the beginning." Jacob left with his hands shaking. She was right. The vault was just the surface. What lay beneath the stone, was what the letter warned about, what Esther had feared, what Miriam had spoken of, a second chamber. He returned home and unrolled the photocopies of the bishop's ledger again. The entry for DH stood out now. DH. Repeated infractions. Last seen May 4th. No transfer requested. That was the day before Esther's final journal entry. 6 stones, 6 missing youths, all gone within 2 months, and now a second chamber. He had to see it. The following night, Jacob returned. This time he brought a rope, a second lantern, and a canvas satchel filled with gloves, a knife, and a notepad. He waited until after midnight, when even the crickets had fallen silent. He lifted the stone and slipped down the shaft. The ladder was iron, cold and damp beneath his hands. It descended only 10 feet, then opened into a chamber even darker than the vault above. The air was heavy with mildew and something older, something sour, like water left to rot in a sealed barrel. His lantern flared as he stepped down. This room was different, crude. The walls weren't finished stone like the vault. They were cut from clay and packed earth, reinforced in places with broken beams and what looked like old barn wood. And in the center, a stone slab, stained dark. A rusted chain bolted into the floor beside it. Jacob approached slowly, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoing off the walls. Beside the slab was a pile of decaying cloth, brittle and stained, with the vague outline of a bonnet still clinging to the top. A few feet away, the skeletal frame of a child's doll, its fabric long gone, only the wooden core and glass eyes remaining. He knelt and examined the chain. It was bolted deep, no signs of removal. The ring was bent, like someone had pulled on it, hard. This room wasn't a burial chamber, it was a holding cell, a place of punishment, or worse. He took photos, every inch, every object, every stain. And when he climbed back out, he locked the shaft again and covered the hatch with earth and stone. No one would find it unless he showed them. And he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The next morning he called Sheriff Rankin. "I found something new," he said. "You're calling from a landline," she noted. "Yes, it's safer that way." "Where are you?" "The house." He paused. "There's a second room, beneath the vault, a hidden chamber. I can take you there, but you need to come alone. No uniforms, no lights, no cameras. That's irregular." "Please," she agreed. That night, under the cover of dusk, Jacob led her through the meeting house and down into the vault. He pried open the stone, lowered the ladder, and watched her descend. Her flashlight beam cut across the darkness in sharp, sterile arcs. She was quiet for a long time. When she came back up, she looked different, paler, more rigid. "We'll need a warrant," she said. "I know. Can you keep this sealed for 48 hours? Jacob nodded. "Good," she said, "because if this is what I think it is, we're not just dealing with murder, we're dealing with ritual abuse, possibly coordinated, possibly covered up for decades." Jacob stared at the floor. "What happens next?" Sheriff Rankin looked at him. "We dig," she said, "and this time, we don't stop." By Monday morning, the vault beneath East Bridge Meeting House was declared an active crime scene. No one was told why. Sheriff Rankin filed the paperwork quietly, bypassing the usual county alerts. The warrant arrived sealed. The forensic team arrived in plain clothes and unmarked vans, their gear packed in black duffels, their demeanor quiet and focused. Jacob stood at the side of the gravel lot as they unloaded. "You sure you want to be here for this?" Rankin asked. He nodded. "It started with me. I'll see it through." She gave him a look that said she respected that, but also that what lay ahead wouldn't be easy to witness. They entered through the back of the meeting house just after sunrise, when the sky still held a trace of blue and silver and the dew clung to the weeds around the foundation. Jacob led them down the steps and into the vault. The stone hatch had been marked with orange chalk. Sub-level entry. Sealed. Rankin handed Jacob a pair of gloves and a white forensic mask. "From here," she said, "you're a witness, not a guide." He nodded again, this time slower. The stone was lifted. The shaft reopened. Lights were lowered into the darkness, and one by one, the forensics team descended into the buried chamber beneath the church. They worked in total silence for the first hour. Photos were taken, floor grids marked, soil samples bagged and labeled. Then the lead forensic tech, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Kenna Fry, turned to Sheriff Rankin and spoke the words that made Jacob's chest tighten. "We have blood." The stains weren't just discoloration from water or time. They tested positive within minutes. Human blood. embedded into the porous face of the center stone slab. She ran a handheld scanner over it. It's old, likely 30-plus years, but it's everywhere, sprayed, soaked, saturated along the southern edge. Rankin's expression darkened, which suggests movement, a body or bodies struggling. And not just one, Fry added. Look, multiple impact points, different droplet trajectories. Jacob leaned closer. You're saying someone was beaten here? Fry nodded. Or restrained, possibly both. She pointed to the rusted chain bolted into the floor. This wasn't symbolic. This was functional restraint. Whoever was kept here wasn't being watched. They were being held. And the cloth? Rankin asked, gesturing to the decomposed fabric pile near the far wall. Fry crouched beside it. Handmade. Seam stitching matches early plane construction techniques, likely a bonnet. Small size, consistent with teenage girls. Jacob's jaw tightened. Esther, Miriam, the others. We'll know more once we dig, Fry said. But I need to be clear. This wasn't just an unofficial burial site. She stood, brushing off her gloves. This was a containment room, a private, hidden chamber used multiple times over a sustained period. Likely years. By late afternoon, they'd unearthed fragments of 2 more skeletal remains. Both were incomplete. One consisted of a femur, 2 ribs, and a portion of jawbone. The other, barely distinguishable, was a tiny cluster of vertebrae and teeth. Dr. Fry held up a tiny molar between forceps. This one, she said, belonged to a child, likely under the age of 5. Jacob stepped back, nausea rising like bile. A child, he whispered. We didn't know any children were missing. No one was ever reported? Rankin asked. Not from the community, he said. Number, but if someone was pregnant, if the child was born in silence, he didn't finish the sentence. Because he didn't have to. They all knew what it meant. The vault hadn't just held the shamed and the broken. It had held the unwanted. That night, Sheriff Rankin contacted the State Bureau of Investigation. Within 24 hours, the site was federal. Crime scene tents went up behind the meeting house. Agents combed the property with ground-penetrating radar. The community was informed, formally, finally, that the church was closed indefinitely. The bishop called it a violation. Jacob called it justice. Meanwhile, the journal was being transcribed by a linguist at the Bureau. Over 120 entries. Nearly 40,000 words written in delicate script, detailing everything from community rituals to specific punishments, to coded names of elders involved in cleansings. One passage hit Jacob harder than any other. Journal of Esther M. Esch, May 3, 1989. I begged them not to take the baby. They said it would not survive outside of shame, that its soul was better preserved if it never took breath in the English world. I screamed. They gagged me. I kicked. I was held. I was not supposed to write this, but I cannot let my baby go to the earth unnamed. I called her Anna, even if no one else will say it. Jacob didn't speak for hours after reading that. He simply sat in the barn, his eyes burning, the name echoing in his head. Anna. Not just Esther, not just Miriam, but a baby. Born, hidden, and buried beneath a church that claimed to serve God. By Friday, arrest warrants had been issued. Elder King, Elder Stoltzfus, and Deacon Troyer were taken into custody. Their homes were searched, their records seized. One of them, under questioning, admitted that disciplinary measures had once included ritual isolation, but claimed not to know what happened after the prayers ended. The bishop had not yet been charged, but Jacob knew it was only a matter of time, because a second journal had been found, hidden behind a loose beam in the vault's upper chamber, written in a different hand. Signed, M.Y. Bishop Menno Glick didn't speak when the investigators arrived. He greeted them with calm dignity, dressed in a freshly ironed black vest and white shirt. standing in the doorway of his modest farmhouse with the air of a man long accustomed to holding power without question. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask why they were there. He already knew. Sheriff Rankin handed him the search warrant. "We're here to collect any materials related to church discipline between 1985 and 1990. Physical records, journals, correspondence, especially anything related to Esther Esch, Miriam Yoder, or others listed here." She held out a page with 6 names. Only 2 were complete. The rest were initials matched from vault stones and pieced together through months of oral records and land purchase histories. Glick took the page. His eyes scanned it once. "These were difficult years," he said simply. "That doesn't change the law," Rankin replied. He stepped aside. "Then do what you must." The bishop's house was plain, unassuming. Wooden floors, handmade furniture, no radio, no telephone. A place that looked to an outsider like a portrait of virtue. But behind the linen closet, they found a second cabinet, hidden behind a false panel. Inside, dozens of leather-bound ledgers, each marked only by years, each meticulously handwritten, each a quiet record of who had been shamed, silenced, or sent away. And at the back of the 1989 volume, sealed in wax and bound with cord, was a parchment envelope marked only with one name: Esther M. Esch. Jacob sat across from Bishop Glick later that day at the county interview room. It was surreal, seeing the bishop beneath fluorescent lights, without his hat, hands resting flat on a table that belonged to the English world. The man who had once preached at Jacob's baptism now stared across the room like a man exiled from his own kingdom. Jacob's voice was steady. "I found her bones." The bishop said nothing. "I read her journal. I read yours." Still nothing. "She had a child. You called her a shame to the Ordnung. You buried her beneath God's house, and then you told the rest of us to forget." Glick exhaled slowly. "You don't understand what it was like," he said finally. "The weight we carried. You buried girls alive." "We tried to preserve what was holy," the bishop replied, voice low. "To keep the community from being swallowed by the world. You think that's easy? When temptation is everywhere, when the young forget their place, when the outside world offers them escape. You killed her. We corrected her." "No," Jacob said, voice rising. "You silenced her." Glick leaned forward. "And you, we gave you everything. Your father, your home, your tools. We taught you to hold your tongue. But now you've chosen them." Jacob didn't blink. "I chose the truth." That evening, Bishop Glick was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, covering up unlawful death, and obstruction of justice. The community was stunned, but not surprised. Not anymore. 2 days later, a state forensic team confirmed what Jacob had feared from the moment he read Esther's last journal entry. The partial remains of a newborn infant, found in the lower chamber, wrapped in fragments of cloth, shared enough mitochondrial DNA to confirm maternity with the bones identified as Esther Esch. She had been buried with her baby. The news broke publicly the next morning. Local headlines first. Bones found beneath Amish church. 6 unnamed graves, justice 30 years later. State police investigate ritual chamber beneath meeting house. Then the nationals picked it up. Cable news anchors stood beside cornfields and gravel roads, struggling to explain a community they didn't understand. Drone footage showed the meeting house from above, its white frame pristine, the grass freshly mowed, even as search tents and evidence markers dotted the yard behind it. Jacob turned off the TV. He didn't need the world's opinion. He'd seen the truth with his own eyes. He returned to the vault once more, this time with Esther's mother. Lila Esch had been moved from assisted living to a care suite in town. When Jacob told her what had been found, she hadn't cried. She hadn't shouted. She had simply asked, "Can I see where my daughter died?" He brought her himself. They moved slowly, down the stone stairs, through the vault, to the marked grave. She touched the stone carved with E.E. "My husband believed what they told him," she whispered, "that she had run away, that she was lost to the world." She looked at Jacob. "I never believed it." He nodded, unsure what to say. She bent slowly, bones creaking, breath shallow, and laid her hand on the dirt. "You're home now," she said softly. "I'll say your name every day." Jacob left the church that night and didn't return. He didn't leave the Amish way of life, not yet. But he stopped attending services. He stopped attending meetings. He refused to answer when elders called. He spent his days building furniture in silence and his nights reading the transcribed journals of forgotten girls. And he waited, because there were still 5 graves without names. And justice wasn't finished. Jacob stood at the edge of the graveyard, watching the fog roll in across the low fields as dawn painted the sky a dull gray. The air carried the scent of moist earth, wood smoke, and honeysuckle. It should have been a morning for peace. But this wasn't a burial. Not really. The state had authorized a temporary exhumation of 3 burial plots at the far edge of the church cemetery. Simple wooden markers with initials only. According to records, they belonged to older members who had died of illness between 1986 and 1991. But something didn't sit right. 2 weeks earlier, a tip had arrived. Anonymous, typed on a single sheet of paper. The vault wasn't the only place. Check the graves near the west gate. 3 were buried there without bodies. The names were for show. The names had matched AK, CS, and DH, 3 of the 6 sets of initials from the stones in the vault. Jacob had told Sheriff Rankin. Now, under a gray canvas tent, forensic techs in gloves and sterile suits were digging through the topsoil of graves that had once been considered sacred. The first coffin was empty. So was the second. The third held a box of bricks, wrapped in linen, arranged to mimic the weight and shape of a small body. Dr. Kenna Fry examined the grave markers herself. There were no burial vaults, no decay patterns in the wood, no signs a human body was ever here. Sheriff Rankin folded her arms. They faked the burials. Jacob stared at the empty graves. They gave the community closure, he said quietly, while the real graves were hidden in the vault. And it worked, Rankin said. For 30 years, no one asked questions. That afternoon, Jacob returned to the Esch property, the land where Esther had grown up. He stood at the edge of the old pasture, long since reclaimed by weeds and goldenrod. The house had collapsed in on itself years ago. The barn was a skeleton, but the orchard still stood. 6 apple trees, each one planted by hand, according to Esther's journal. One of them had initials carved in its trunk, E+J. Jacob traced it with his fingers. Her journal entry had mentioned it once. Jacob Yoder gave me the carving knife, said I could make my mark. I used it to put our initials on the orchard tree. He left a week later, sent away for dishonoring his vows. Jacob turned toward the fields, lips pressed together. The name hadn't been in any of the bishop's ledgers. Jacob Yoder, a name buried in silence, erased like the girls. He went to the township office and asked for records of all Amish boys expelled between 1985 and 1990. The clerk frowned. They're private unless criminal charges were filed. I don't need crimes, Jacob said. I need names. After enough pressing and a few quiet calls from the sheriff, he was handed a short list. There it was. Yoder, Jacob L. Expelled March 1989 for violation of marital vow. Left district same year. Destination unknown. Jacob took down the address of the Yoder farm. It had been sold in 1991. The house was demolished. The land now belonged to a retired veterinarian and his wife. But tucked in the archives was a note from the sale file. Previous owner relocated to Elkhart, Indiana. Jacob borrowed the sheriff's landline to place the call. The man who answered was quiet, gruff. "Yes," he said after a pause. "I was Jacob Yoder." "I need to speak with you," Jacob Lance said. "It's about Esther." The silence on the other end stretched long. Then, "I'll meet you halfway." They met in a diner off Route 30, an old converted train car with cracked red booths and faded menus. Yoder was in his 50s now, bearded, hair thinning at the temples, but his eyes were still sharp. "You look like Abraham Lance," he said as Jacob sat across from him. "I'm his son. I remember you. You were just a boy." Jacob laid a copy of Esther's journal on the table. Yoder didn't touch it, but he didn't look away either. "She wrote about you," Jacob said. "Carving trees, giving her the knife." Yoder's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "I was 19. She was 17. We weren't careful, but we were in love. You were sent away. They didn't give me a choice. I confessed to the bishop, hoping to do the right thing. He said I had shamed her, that I had two options: leave quietly or face public banishment." Jacob slid the journal forward. "She carried your child." Yoder stared at the cover. "I didn't know she was pregnant." "She died in that church," Jacob said, "in a vault beneath the pulpit, and the child was buried with her." Yoder's face crumpled. "I would have taken her," he said. "I would have raised them both. I didn't know. They told me she'd left for Ohio, that she'd gone willingly, that she didn't want to see me." "They lied." Tears traced down the older man's cheeks. "I would have built her a home. I would have done anything." Jacob left the journal with him. Back in Lancaster County, the investigation widened. Elder King's confession triggered more tips. A former church record keeper came forward, anonymously. She provided lists of names, dates, families whose daughters left for Ohio and never returned. Some had been real departures, some hadn't. The list of potential victims now numbered 11. Jacob studied each one. One night, as he read through the documents, a name caught his eye. Ruth Glick, daughter of Menno Glick, expelled June 1990. Cause: moral failure. Destination: unknown. Jacob brought the file to Sheriff Rankin. "This is his daughter," he said. "She vanished too." Rankin made a call to the State Records Division. There were no traces of Ruth Glick anywhere. No marriage license, no death certificate, no hospital visits. Her name stopped existing after 1990. Jacob returned to the vault one last time. He stood at the back wall, where the bones of Esther and her baby had been removed. The dirt still bore the imprint of their final cradle. He knelt and whispered their names aloud. Esther. Anna. Then he crossed to the unnamed stones. M.Y., Miriam Yoder, C.S., Clara Stoltzfus, D.H., Daniel Hawk, A.K., Anna King, B.R., Beulah Ropp. And finally, at the 6th, R.G., Ruth Glick. Not forgotten, not anymore. The state issued its first official press release on a cold Monday morning in December, just as frost began to cling to the fence posts along the outer farms. It was simple, almost sterile, in tone. Preliminary forensic findings from Eastbridge Township suggest a pattern of concealed deaths within an unregistered chamber beneath a religious meeting house. 6 sets of human remains have been recovered, including one newborn child. Investigation continues into circumstances surrounding deaths and possible obstruction by local religious leadership. But it didn't stay sterile for long. Within hours, reporters were everywhere. On gravel roads, leaning over fences, staking out the sheriff's office. They wanted interviews, sound bites, emotion. They wanted to put a face to the silence. Jacob Lance didn't give them one. He stayed behind his lathe. He answered no questions. He turned off his phone, but someone else did speak. Her name was Emily Fields, a former student at Elizabethtown College who had written her senior thesis on cultural silence and communal discipline among the plain people of Pennsylvania. She had interviewed dozens of ex-Amish youth over the years, many of whom spoke, off the record, about rumors of disappearances. One name kept surfacing in her notes: Miriam Yoder. Emily's old professor had forwarded the name to the task force weeks earlier. And now, at the request of the state investigators, she'd returned to Lancaster County to dig through her original recordings. In her files, buried in a dusty folder, was a 1996 audio cassette. A woman's voice, soft, nervous, speaking under the hum of static. I was 16. They took her into the basement after prayers. The preacher said it was God's judgment, that we weren't to interfere. But I heard her. She screamed for her baby. Then it stopped. The tape was time-stamped 4 months after Esther Esch's death. The woman never gave her name, but the voice belonged to someone on the current investigations list of left the community but not traced. Beulah Ropp. Initials: BR, same as the 5th stone in the vault. Dr. Kenna Fry, now leading the forensic team full-time, examined the remains identified as BR again. The bones showed old fractures, partially healed, on the wrists, ribs, and left cheekbone. Repeated blunt force trauma, she told Sheriff Rankin, months before death. This was a pattern of abuse, not a single incident. Jacob read the report and had to leave the room. He walked out into the cold, stood barefoot in the grass, and let the wind numb his thoughts. They hadn't just been hidden, they'd been tortured. Meanwhile, the second journal, Miriam Yoder's, was being deciphered. It was more erratic than Esther's, less structured. The handwriting trembled in places, as if written in fear or in haste, but it told its own truths. They said the vault was a place of silence, but there were sounds. We weren't supposed to speak, but we heard each other. When Esther stopped crying, the rest of us knew it was real. They weren't sending us away. They were burying us here. The English press dubbed it the Vault of Silence. Jacob hated the name. It felt too clean, too theatrical, as if what had happened here was some kind of gothic mystery instead of premeditated ritual abuse and murder. He wanted a name that told the truth. Not a vault, a mass grave. The district attorney called for a public grand jury. Testimonies were gathered, some anonymous, some brave. Former community members came forward, mostly young women, who spoke of being forced to fast in barns for punishment, being told they had demons in their wombs, watching their sisters or cousins vanish without ever learning why. Several described a man named Elias Brubaker, a preacher from Ohio who had been invited to speak in Lancaster County in the late 1980s. Jacob remembered the name. Esther had written it once. Elias B. came again this week. He looked at me during the hymns. Afterward, the bishop asked him to stay late. I heard them arguing in the barn. A search of Ohio church records revealed that Elias Brubaker had been accused of improper conduct with a minor in 1992, but no charges were filed. He had relocated, vanished, no known address. A bench warrant was issued, but no one expected him to be found. Meanwhile, back in Lancaster, the community had begun to fracture. Half the congregants left East Bridge entirely, transferring to neighboring districts or abandoning the Ordnung altogether. The other half stayed, angrily, stubbornly, with hands folded and eyes downturned. They blamed the world, the news, the English poison that had crept into their way of life and desecrated their meeting house. Jacob's father was among them. They hadn't spoken in weeks. But one night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Jacob heard footsteps on the porch. Abraham Lance stood at the threshold, hat in hand. "You did what you thought was right," he said quietly. Jacob said nothing. Abraham stared at the ground. "I believed them, Jacob. I believed what they told us, that these girls had chosen to leave, that their souls were beyond saving. I never imagined they were beneath our feet." Jacob's voice cracked. "I prayed above her grave, for years, thinking she'd run." They stood in silence for a long time. Then Abraham said, "What do you need from me?" Jacob looked at him. "The names, the ones who knew. Who were there?" Abraham nodded slowly, and began to speak. That testimony, given in full, on the record, under oath, led to 3 more arrests, 2 former deacons, 1 surviving elder. Each had taken part in at least 1 cleansing. Each admitted that the room beneath the vault had been used to correct the unrepentant. One of them confessed to binding Ruth Glick, the bishop's own daughter, during a 3-day prayer fast. Ruth had stopped breathing sometime during the 2nd night. Her death was never reported. Her body was never found. She had likely been buried under the east wall, an area of the chamber still being excavated. Jacob stood outside the site that day, watching the backhoe peel back layers of earth from behind the pulpit. He could hear the shovel's teeth scrape against something beneath the soil. Then a call. "We have another set of remains." That night, Jacob wrote the names down by hand. All of them. The initials on the stones, the names matched by journals, records, and now skeletal remains. He wrote them once, then again, then a 3rd time, until the pen shook in his hand. He added 1 more name, Ruth. No initials, just her full name, because she'd never had a stone. Not even that. There was an understanding, spoken or not, that the old men would never be touched. The ones who sat in the front row of every service, who bowed their heads slowly when scripture was read, who never raised their voices, because they didn't need to. The ordnung ran through them like marrow through bone. They were the ones the bishop answered to, not formally, but in practice. They were the elders emeritus, retired from public roles but still presiding over decisions behind closed doors. Some of them hadn't been seen at the meeting house in years. But when the fire burned through the rafters, when the vault was discovered, when the arrests began, they gathered again, and Jacob Lance followed them. It began with a tip, a voicemail left on Sheriff Rankin's burner phone at 2:41 a.m. "There's a meeting, not at the church, at the Miller Barn, north side of Grider's Hollow. No women, no deacons, just the ones who were there the night Esther died." Rankin called Jacob first. "You think it's real?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then I'll get you a wire." The old Miller barn hadn't housed the animals in over 2 decades. The roof sagged, and half the back wall had been reinforced with salvaged tin. But the loft remained intact, and that's where Jacob waited, tucked behind a hay rake and 3 rotting apple crates, the wire tucked beneath his collar. Below, the men gathered in silence. 7 of them. He knew their names, knew their faces, knew their sons and grandsons. One was his cousin's father. Another had baptized him. They spoke in low German at first. Careful, measured. Then the conversation shifted, and the English came out. "We told Glick not to get sloppy. He put his own daughter in the vault. That wasn't just arrogance. That was desperation. They'll tear us apart if we don't get ahead of this. There's still time to preserve the order." Jacob clenched his fists. Then one of them, Elder Reuben Mast, nearly 90 and long thought senile, spoke clearly. "We were not monsters. We did what was necessary to contain rebellion. If one girl led others astray, what would have become of the Ordnung, of our daughters, our wives?" Another replied, "The vault was meant as silence, not death." It wasn't until Brubaker arrived that the deaths began. "He came with authority," another said. "Glick trusted him. We all did." Jacob didn't move. His heart pounded. His mouth tasted like dust. They were naming names. They were confirming everything. "And now?" Mast asked. "We wait. Let Glick fall. Let the world fixate on him. Once he's gone, the fury will pass. The English lose interest. The community rebuilds." Jacob slid out of the loft like a shadow and slipped into the trees behind the barn. He had everything he needed. Sheriff Rankin reviewed the recording 3 times. "This is conspiracy," she said. "Clear, sustained, coordinated. Will you arrest them?" Rankin tapped her pen against the table. "They're old. Most are in their 80s. 2 are bedbound. Legally, it's strong enough. Politically, it's dynamite. Jacob's voice was flat. They helped kill her. I know. Then what are we waiting for? She looked up. Nothing. The arrests made headlines. 7 elders indicted, 3 charged with conspiracy, 4 named as complicit. None resisted. None confessed. None spoke publicly. Their families claimed they were innocent, that they were being scapegoated for sins of a bygone era. Jacob watched as Elder Mast was wheeled into the courthouse in a worn wheelchair, wrapped in a black shawl. He said nothing as the cameras clicked. He didn't need to, because the tapes said everything. Meanwhile, Dr. Kennefry's team had completed full DNA sequencing on the remains recovered from the vault and adjacent chamber. They had positively identified 5 of the 6 primary victims. Esther Marie Esch, 19, died May 1989, blunt force trauma to skull and pelvis. Miriam Yoder, 15, died June 1989, asphyxiation likely caused by restraint. Beulah Ropp, 17, died late 1989, multiple healed fractures prior to death. Daniel Hawk, 16, died April 1990, sharp force trauma to neck. Ruth Glick, 18, daughter of Bishop Glick, died mid-1990, starvation and exposure. The 6th body, matching infant female remains, was confirmed to be the daughter of Esther Esch. Anna, Jacob whispered when he read the report. Her name was Anna. They were preparing to return the remains to families where possible. Burials would be held. Finally, officially, above ground, with names. One afternoon, as Jacob left the sheriff's office, he found an envelope pinned beneath his windshield wiper. There was no return address, just a single photograph inside. It showed an altar stone, blood-stained, with a crude wooden symbol carved into its edge, 2 intersecting circles surrounded by dots. The photo had been printed on glossy paper, like something developed in a drugstore, and on the back, typed, "This was not the only vault." The old Miller barn hadn't housed the animals in over 2 decades. The roof sagged, and half the back wall had been reinforced with salvaged tin. But the loft remained intact, and that's where Jacob waited, tucked behind a hay rake and 3 rotting apple crates, the wire tucked beneath his collar. Below, the men gathered in silence. 7 of them. He knew their names, knew their faces, knew their sons and grandsons. One was his cousin's father, another had baptized him. They spoke in low German at first, careful, measured. Then the conversation shifted, and the English came out. "We told Glick not to get sloppy. He put his own daughter in the vault. That wasn't just arrogance. That was desperation. They'll tear us apart if we don't get ahead of this. There's still time to preserve the order." Jacob clenched his fists. Then one of them, Elder Reuben Mast, nearly 90 and long thought senile, spoke clearly. "We were not monsters. We did what was necessary to contain rebellion. If one girl led others astray, what would have become of the Ordnung, of our daughters, our wives?" Another replied, "The vault was meant as silence, not death." It wasn't until Brubaker arrived that the deaths began. "He came with authority," another said. "Glick trusted him. We all did." Jacob didn't move. His heart pounded. His mouth tasted like dust. They were naming names. They were confirming everything. "And now?" Mast asked. "We wait. Let Glick fall. Let the world fixate on him. Once he's gone, the fury will pass. The English lose interest. The community rebuilds." Jacob slid out of the loft like a shadow and slipped into the trees behind the barn. He had everything he needed. Sheriff Rankin reviewed the recording 3 times. "This is conspiracy," she said. "Clear, sustained, coordinated. Will you arrest them?" Rankin tapped her pen against the table. "They're old. Most are in their 80s. 2 are bedbound. Legally, it's strong enough. Politically, It's dynamite. Jacob's voice was flat. They helped kill her. I know. Then what are we waiting for? She looked up. Nothing. The arrests made headlines. 7 elders indicted, 3 charged with conspiracy, 4 named as complicit. None resisted. None confessed. None spoke publicly. Their families claimed they were innocent, that they were being scapegoated for sins of a bygone era. Jacob watched as Elder Mast was wheeled into the courthouse in a worn wheelchair, wrapped in a black shawl. He said nothing as the cameras clicked. He didn't need to, because the tapes said everything. Meanwhile, Dr. Kennefry's team had completed full DNA sequencing on the remains recovered from the vault and adjacent chamber. They had positively identified 5 of the 6 primary victims. Esther Marie Esch, 19, died May 1989, blunt force trauma to skull and pelvis. Miriam Yoder, 15, died June 1989, asphyxiation likely caused by restraint. Beulah Ropp, 17, died late 1989, multiple healed fractures prior to death. Daniel Hawk, 16, died April 1990, sharp force trauma to neck. Ruth Glick, 18, daughter of Bishop Glick, died mid-1990, starvation and exposure. The 6th body, matching infant female remains, was confirmed to be the daughter of Esther Esch. Anna, Jacob whispered when he read the report. Her name was Anna. They were preparing to return the remains to families where possible. Burials would be held. Finally, officially, above ground, with names. One afternoon, as Jacob left the sheriff's office, he found an envelope pinned beneath his windshield wiper. There was no return address, just a single photograph inside. It showed an altar stone, blood-stained, with a crude wooden symbol carved into its edge, 2 intersecting circles surrounded by dots. The photo had been printed on glossy paper, like something developed in a drugstore, and on the back, typed, "This was not the only vault." Jacob Lance held the photograph in his hands long after the wind had blown dust across the windshield, and dusk had begun to settle over the ridge. 2 circles, dots around the edge. Blood on stone. He had never seen the symbol before. Not in the vault, not in Esther's journal, not in the bishop's records. But it looked ancient, deliberate, like a seal or a warning. He drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Rankin stared at the photo for a long time. "You're sure this wasn't taken in the meeting house vault?" Jacob shook his head. "Ours never had that symbol. And that altar stone. Ours had damage, cracks. This one's whole." Rankin tapped the photo against her knuckles. "Then we may be looking at another site. You think it's local?" She shrugged. "Could be. Or it could be someone playing games. Then why send it to me?" "Because you listened," she said. "And because they're not done." The state task force convened a late-night strategy session. The photo was scanned, enlarged, enhanced. A digital forensics specialist noted that the paper used had a watermark from a photo lab in Lidditz, just 20 miles north. Detectives visited the lab the next morning. The employee remembered the order immediately. "Came in 3 days ago," she said. "Man in plain clothes, didn't give a name, paid in cash, said he was archiving old family photos, only had that one print. Security footage showed a man in his 50s, wearing a flat cap and wire-rimmed glasses. The footage was grainy, no clear ID, but the timestamp gave them a lead. From the same timestamp, they pulled cell tower pings, and one number kept appearing. A prepaid phone used only 5 times in the last month. Once near Lidditz, once near Greeter's Hollow, once near East Bridge, and twice near Lebanon Township. Jacob's chest tightened. "There used to be a meeting house there," he said aloud. "Abandoned since the 70s. The congregation merged with ours after a fire." Rankin raised her eyebrows. "You sure?" "My uncle helped strip the pews. Said the place gave him chills. The foundation's still there. off a dirt road past the quarry. They went in without lights, just past midnight, under a new moon, with 5 officers and 1 dog trained to detect human remains. The path was narrow, barely visible, overgrown with ivy and nettles. The tree line pressed close on both sides, as if trying to swallow the trail back into the woods. The building was gone, reduced to a rotting frame, the ghost of a roof, and a hollow outline of stone. But the floor still stood, slate and cedar covered in moss, and in the center, an altar stone, whole, uncracked, and at its base, carved into the moss-worn surface, 2 intersecting circles surrounded by 6 dots. Jacob stepped forward, flashlight low, heart pounding. "It's the same symbol." Fry examined the carving. "This wasn't decorative," she said. "It's a mark of ritual, maybe calendar-based or directional." The dog began to bark, loud, urgent. It circled the altar 3 times, then sat, head tilted at the northeast corner of the stone slab. Fry knelt, ran her hand along the seam. "There's space beneath it," she said. "Cavernous." Dry Rankin looked at Jacob. "We dig at first light." By sunrise, they had unearthed a second vault, not as large as the first, cruder. The stairs were hand-cut into stone, the walls lined in uneven planks. The air was thick with rot and old dust. It smelled like abandonment. Jacob was the first to descend. His flashlight beam swept the chamber. Low ceiling, rough floor, 2 rusted buckets, 1 overturned bench, and along the far wall, 4 wooden panels, each marked with a name. Not initials, names. Leah Kaufman, Joanna Byler, Naomi Stutzman. The last was blank, only a scratched X. All women, all gone before 1980. Jacob didn't recognize the names. Fry arrived moments later and began scanning for organic matter. Within 20 minutes, she confirmed, "Human decomposition present in 3 of 4 panels." Rankin joined them. 3 graves, she said, and 1 space waiting to be filled. Jacob turned to her. "These weren't our victims. These are older. This vault predates East Bridge." Fry looked at the beams again. "Someone built this long before the others, but it's the same design, same purpose." "Who ran this meeting house?" Rankin asked. Jacob searched his memory. "I don't know. The records would be in the old district archives, maybe in the bishop's ledger." Rankin made the call. By nightfall, the 4th grave had been opened. Inside, a shawl, a bonnet, and no bones. It had been prepared, but never used. Rankin turned to Jacob. "This was a template," she said. "Your vault wasn't the beginning. It was a continuation." Jacob swallowed hard. There could be more. They brought the names to a retired archivist, once a record keeper for the Lebanon Township Meeting House. She sat in her kitchen, hands trembling as she flipped through dusty logs. Her voice quavered. "These girls, they were labeled unruly, independent. I remember Leah. She asked questions. They said she left for Ohio." "Did anyone ever verify that?" Rankin asked. The woman shook her head. "No one ever asked. The bones recovered from this second vault were brittle and collapsed, but one yielded a wedding band, inscribed in Pennsylvania Dutch, für Wahrheit und Gehorsam, for truth and obedience." Rankin held it in her hand, staring at the words. They turned obedience into a death sentence. 2 vaults, 10 known victims, and now signs of a pattern, decades long. The team began to cross-reference excommunications across rural Pennsylvania. They looked for spikes in expulsions, especially involving young women. A clear pattern emerged, clusters of shunnings every 5 to 7 years, and in each cluster, at least 1 person disappeared. Jacob returned to the orchard on the Esch property. The trees were bare now. The carving faded, but he stood beneath them anyway, hands in his pockets, looking at the sky. They had only just begun to unearth the dead, And they still hadn't counted the living who'd been shaped by silence. He turned toward the fields, wind tugging at his coat. "This ends now," he said aloud. Not for the cameras, not for the courts, but for the names that had never been spoken aloud. The letter arrived in a brown envelope, no return address, hand-delivered to Sheriff Rankin's office by a boy no older than 10. He'd ridden in on a bicycle, said nothing, and rode off before anyone could ask his name. Inside the envelope was a folded page, yellowed and creased, written in precise, slanted cursive. "To the one who has been digging in the bones, you think you've found it all. You haven't. You think the vault at East Bridge was the worst of it. It wasn't. I was there the night Esther died. I was there the night her baby was born. I was the one who told them she had to be silenced. But I wasn't the one who buried her. That was the bishop. And I can prove it." M.S. Rankin read it twice, then placed it in Jacob's hands. He stared at the initials. "M.S. Mast," he said. "Elder Reuben Mast. We thought he was senile." "He's not," Rankin said. "He's preparing for the end." They found Mast in the county infirmary, confined to a hospital bed with oxygen tubes running from his nose. He was awake, alert, and fully aware of why they were there. Jacob stood at the foot of the bed. "You sent the letter?" Mast gave a slow, rattling nod. "You said you could prove it." He lifted a shaking hand and pointed to the Bible on his nightstand. "Back cover." Jacob opened it. Taped inside was a photograph. Faded, slightly curled. It showed Bishop Glick standing in the vault, shovel in hand, over what looked like a shallow pit lined with stone. Next to him, Esther, unconscious or possibly dead, her head resting against the side of the slab. There was blood, there was cloth, and in the corner of the frame, a baby, wrapped in linen. Jacob's vision blurred. "Why?" he whispered. Mast didn't answer at first. Then finally, "Because we were afraid of what the truth would do. To your souls." "To our power," he said. The photo was authenticated. The date matched the film batch used in the late 1980s. The image was real. The figures were confirmed. It was evidence of premeditated murder. Sheriff Rankin moved swiftly. Bishop Glick, already in custody, was re-interviewed, confronted with the photograph. He didn't deny it, but he didn't explain either. He simply said, "We had no choice." A week later, Reuben Mast passed away. He was buried quietly by his family, without ceremony. The photo he'd sent became the centerpiece of the state's case. It did more than confirm Esther's death. It triggered the reopening of 5 other cold cases, unconnected until now, across rural Pennsylvania, Ohio, and upstate New York. All former Plain communities, all with histories of sudden disappearances. In the weeks that followed, Jacob sat through 4 separate funerals, one for Esther and Anna, buried together in a shared grave marked with their full names, one for Miriam Yoder, whose father stood beside Jacob, silent and weeping, one for Beulah Ropp, whose sister returned from Canada to give the eulogy, and one for Daniel Hoch, whose body had been buried under the pretense of mental defect and had never been claimed until now. Each funeral drew more people. Survivors, defectors, outsiders who had once been insiders. Each service was simple. Each grave was marked. Each name was spoken. After the last funeral, Jacob stood beside Esther's headstone, alone. He laid his palm against the polished granite and said her name aloud. "Esther Marie Esch, I remember you." Then, softer, "Anna." He turned, scanning the rows of names. No longer initials, no longer rumors. People. Back at the site of the second vault, excavations continued. They uncovered fragments of another set of remains, this time male, early 20s. Preliminary analysis suggested death by hanging, evidenced by trauma to the neck vertebrae. Beside the bones, a carved piece of hickory wood, smoothed at the edges, bore 3 initials, Yabi Jacob stared at the letters. Elias Brubaker, the missing preacher, the one who had brought the darkness with him. They hadn't found him alive, but they had found where he ended. The investigation concluded with 9 confirmed victims, 6 at East Bridge, 3 at Lebanon. 1 child, 1 preacher, 7 girls. Dozens more remained unknown. Some families refused to cooperate. Some churches went silent. But the pattern had been revealed, and the vaults, the literal architecture of silence, had been exposed. The state closed the case after 14 months. The FBI issued a formal report. Closed religious societies can provide fertile ground for unchecked power, ritual abuse, and multi-generational trauma. Jacob didn't care for the wording. It sounded like a paper, not a graveyard. On the 1-year anniversary of the discovery, Jacob held a service in the orchard. No pulpit, no preacher, just a circle of benches beneath the trees Esther once tended. Survivors came, families came, names were read, tears were shed. And then quietly, someone handed Jacob a worn leather pouch. Inside, Esther's knife, the one used to carve initials in the bark. He ran his finger along the handle. She had left her mark. Now, so would he. The snow came late that year. It dusted the ridge in early January, quiet and patient, blanketing the fields like a shroud. The orchard stood still, the branches bare, and beneath their roots lay a grave, unmarked by stone, but heavy with memory. Jacob Lance stood beneath the oldest tree, Esther's tree. The bark had split where time had cracked the carving. E+J, still faintly visible. He knelt there, in the cold, the earth frozen but not unyielding. He was planting something. A stone, flat, hand-polished, with words etched not by machine, but by hand, chiseled slow, like pennants. Esther Marie Esch, 1970 to 1989. Anna Esch, 1989 to 1989. Loved in silence, remembered in truth. He placed the stone into the ground, tucked it deep among the roots, and patted the soil firm. A year had passed since the vault was found. The state had closed its formal inquiry, but the truth had kept echoing. Other counties had reopened cold cases. Journalists had begun publishing memoirs. A documentary was underway. But none of it felt finished to Jacob, because silence doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers, especially in the places where it once thrived. He visited the new community center in East Bridge, built where the old schoolhouse once stood. Inside were photos, smiling girls, faded hymns, empty pews, and in the corner, a glass case. It held 6 items: a bonnet, a child's boot, a page from Esther's journal, the worn carving knife, the hand-latched lock from the vault door, and a shard of the cracked altar stone above it hung a plaque. In memory of those who were hidden, silenced, or lost. We speak their names. We remember. Jacob stepped out of the building into crisp air. He stood there for a long while, watching 2 young girls hop between patches of snow, their laughter echoing like wind chimes. He looked down at his hands, scarred, dry, calloused from the wood shop. He had built things his whole life, but nothing had cost him more than truth. Sheriff Rankin retired that spring. Before she left, she came by Jacob's shop. He poured her coffee in a cracked blue mug. "You changed everything," she told him. Jacob shook his head. "They did. I just listened." She set down the mug. Most people wouldn't have. That fall, the final name was etched into a stone and laid beside the others. Ruth Glick. No one came to her burial. Not her father, serving a life sentence, not her siblings, not her church, just Jacob. And one former deacon who kept his distance, hat in hand. Ruth had died in darkness, but she was buried in light. The orchard bloomed early the next spring. 6 trees, 6 girls. Each tree bore fruit. Each tree carried initials somewhere on its trunk. One day, a class of local students came through on a field trip. A girl, maybe 10, asked Jacob why the trees had names. He knelt beside her and said, "Because they were people, and they were never supposed to be forgotten." The girl reached out and touched the bark gently. "They're still here." Jacob nodded, in the roots and in the remembering. That night, Jacob returned to his workshop. He opened Esther's journal one final time. The last page was blank, but he didn't close it. He picked up his pencil and wrote, "We didn't bury the truth. We planted it, and truth has roots." The vault is gone now, collapsed by order of the state, filled with concrete, sealed beneath the scorched shell of what used to be a sanctuary. Nothing marks the place but a small wooden sign at the edge of the gravel. Property condemned. No entry permitted by law. But the names live on, not just in court records or news archives or forensic ledgers, but in stone. In headstones finally etched with more than just initials, in a school curriculum rewritten to include the story of what happened here. In whispered conversations between mothers and daughters who no longer fear the old words: obedience, silence, shame. Jacob Lance walks the orchard path every Sunday. The trees are taller now, their branches heavy in spring. He knows which one was Esther's. The bark split where they carved their initials, now faded into the ridges like veins. But the tree still blooms, every year. He's rebuilt the shop behind his father's house. A simple space, no electricity, just hand tools and natural light. But in the corner, there's a drawer, locked. Inside it are 6 journals, each recovered, copied, and stored. Esther's, Miriam's, Beulah's, and the others, written by survivors who came forward later. Their handwriting different, their pain the same. He doesn't read them anymore. He doesn't have to. He's memorized every word. In the orchard clearing just beyond the fence stands a new stone, dark granite, wide and unpolished. At its base are 12 names, no longer initials, no longer forgotten. Esther Marie, Esh Anna, Esh Miriam Yoder, Beulah Ropp, Daniel Hoke, Ruth Glick, Leah Kaufman, Joanna Byler, Naomi Stutzman, Elias Brubaker, unnamed infant. 1978, one unknown, Lebanon Township above them, engraved in quiet script. They were not lost, they were taken, and now they are known. Sometimes people still ask Jacob why he stayed, why he didn't walk away from the community that buried its daughters and branded it holy. He doesn't have a neat answer. But when he looks out across the orchard, at the girls planting sunflowers by the fence line, at the families who gather without fear, at the children who speak every name carved into that stone, he knows. Because the ground remembers. Because silence only survives when no one names it. Because someone had to open the vault, and someone had to stay to make sure no one ever closed it again. In memory of the silenced, may their stories outlive the walls that held them.